There's something that institutions do when they're under pressure that most people never quite notice in real time. They don't collapse suddenly. They don't break dramatically in a single moment that everyone can point to and say, "There, that's when it happened." They erode, quietly, incrementally, through 1,000 small decisions made in private rooms by people who convinced themselves that each individual choice was manageable, that the next one would be the last, that the problem would eventually resolve itself if they just held the line a little longer. And then one day, you look up and realize the line was never held at all. It was moved again and again, until there was nowhere left to move it. That's where the British monarchy finds itself in February 2026. And the question I've been sitting with, the one I don't think mainstream coverage has been willing to ask with any real seriousness, isn't just about Prince Andrew, or the arrest, or the files. It's about the man at the top of the institution, a king who is fighting cancer, a king who is watching his brother face criminal investigation while simultaneously trying to hold together an institution that has been quietly absorbing the consequences of that brother's conduct for decades, and a king who, by every credible account emerging this week, is struggling under a weight that no amount of institutional management can make lighter. Because here is what I think we need to understand before we get into the details of what happened and what's coming next. The Epstein crisis and the Andrew arrest are not simply a scandal involving one disgraced prince. They are the visible surface of something that runs much deeper, a pattern of institutional behavior stretching back at least 25 years, a conspiracy of silence that multiple senior officials apparently participated in, and a set of decisions made at the highest levels of the monarchy that protected Andrew, long after it was reasonable or justifiable to do so. And King Charles was at the heart of that institution, through all of it. As prince, as heir, as king, he didn't create the problem. But the question being raised by serious observers with increasing urgency is whether he did enough, or anything, to stop it. Let's ground this properly, because context matters enormously here. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has been a source of institutional embarrassment for the British monarchy for a very long time. His association with Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex offender and trafficker, was not a secret revealed suddenly when the files became public. It was known, discussed, managed. The 2019 BBC interview, in which Andrew appeared to defend his friendship with Epstein and demonstrated a startling absence of empathy for Epstein's victims, was catastrophic enough that his withdrawal from public duties followed within days. His military titles were eventually stripped. He was publicly distanced from working royal life. And yet, and this is the part that demands closer examination, he remained at Royal Lodge. He retained access to royal properties, funded in part by public money. The private connections persisted. The institution absorbed the damage and continued. Why? That's the question that doesn't get asked often enough in polite coverage of this family. Why, given everything that was known about Andrew's associations, given the severity of what the 2019 interview revealed about his judgment and his character, did the institutional response stop short of the full reckoning that the situation seemed to demand? A former royal protection officer went on record this week alleging a conspiracy of silence lasting over 25 years. Multiple senior officials aware of Andrew's controversial conduct and choosing not to act. If that account is even partially accurate, it implies that the protection of Andrew wasn't a failure of the system. It was a feature of it. a deliberate, sustained choice made by people who understood exactly what they were doing and decided that managing the problem quietly was preferable to confronting it honestly. And now that choice has a cost that is, by all credible accounts, being paid in part by a man with cancer who is also a king. The detail that stopped me when I read it this week wasn't the arrest itself, or the property searches, or the legal proceedings beginning to take shape around Andrew's situation. It was Prince William standing at the BAFTA Awards and admitting, in what was described as a startlingly candid moment, that he wasn't in a calm state, that he needed to be in a calm mood to watch a historical drama about grief and loss. A simple, almost throwaway comment. But royal expert commentary immediately identified it for what it was, a rare, unguarded glimpse into the stress levels inside the royal family at this precise moment. And William is not the one with cancer. William is the one who is, by all accounts, still healthy, still functional, still able to manage the weight he's carrying. The person carrying more is his father. Experts speaking this week were unusually direct. The pressures on King Charles are described as intense. William and Catherine are reportedly extremely concerned, not just about the Andrew crisis as a PR and institutional problem, but about the specific, measurable effect that the unrelenting pressure of this situation is having on a man undergoing cancer treatment. That's not spin. That's not palace briefing. That's people close to the situation saying out loud what they've apparently been watching develop with alarm. Here's what I want you to sit with for a moment, because I think it gets to the core of what this crisis actually reveals about the institution. King Charles has spent his entire adult life preparing for a role that required him to be, above all else, a stabilizing force, a figure of continuity, someone who could absorb difficulty without it being visible, who could manage crisis without it becoming public, who understood that the monarchy's survival depended on the appearance of solidity, even when the reality was anything but. And now he is dealing with a cancer diagnosis, a brother under criminal investigation, a constitutional crisis that has no clean resolution, and a son who has, by most accounts, been pressing him harder than anyone in his life to finally draw a line that Charles has historically been unwilling to draw. What the narrative forming around this situation increasingly suggests is that William has been raising the alarm for a significant period of time, that he has pushed repeatedly for the institution to handle the Andrew situation with a decisiveness that Charles has found, for reasons of family loyalty or personal feeling or institutional calculation, very difficult to deliver. The ultimatum that multiple sources have attributed to William, the pressure that reportedly resulted in Charles finally moving toward a public distancing statement, represents something genuinely significant in terms of the internal power dynamics of the monarchy. It suggests that the future king has concluded that the present king cannot protect the institution from the consequences of his own family loyalties, and that someone had to intervene. That intervention, if the accounts are accurate, is both understandable and deeply troubling at the same time. Understandable because William is right. The Andrew situation has been handled with a deference to family feeling that the severity of the circumstances never warranted. Troubling because it raises a question about the institution's chain of authority that doesn't have a comfortable answer. If a future king is effectively directing the strategic decisions of a reigning king who is simultaneously managing a life-threatening illness, what does that mean for the constitutional framework that governs how the monarchy operates. Who is actually making decisions for the crown right now? And how much of what we're seeing presented as Charles's considered institutional response is actually the product of pressure from a son who has run out of patience? The public response to all of this has been telling. The hashtag calling for Charles to abdicate trended briefly on UK social media this week. Polling suggests increasing public support for the idea of handing power to William, a clean break, a fresh start, a monarchy that can point to a clear line separating what came before from what comes next. Constitutional experts have rightly noted that abdication would set an unprecedented and potentially destabilizing precedent. But the very fact that the conversation is happening publicly, in polls, in trending topics, tells you something about how much trust has eroded in the institution under Charles's tenure. Even before accounting for his illness, voices across public forums have begun to wonder whether the question that a prominent royal historian raised this week, "What did Charles know, and when did he know it?" will become the defining question of the rest of his reign. Not what Andrew did, not what the files contain, but what the person at the top of the institution knew about the conduct of the brother he continued to protect long after the evidence of that conduct became public. That question has not been answered. It hasn't really been asked, not with the seriousness it deserves, not by the major outlets that cover this family. And the longer it goes unasked, the more it sits beneath the surface of every development in this story, shaping how people read every palace statement and every expert comment and every carefully managed briefing. The financial dimension of this deserves at least a moment of attention, because it's easy to lose in the noise of the more dramatic elements. The monarchy's contribution to British soft power, royal tourism, and national brand is estimated at billions of pounds annually. That contribution rests entirely on the perception of an institution that stands for something: dignity, continuity, the kind of stability that justifies the extraordinary public investment the monarchy represents. When the institution is instead generating headlines about criminal investigations, conspiracy of silence allegations, and a dying king being pushed toward decisions he doesn't want to make by a son who has run out of patience, that perception erodes, slowly, quietly, exactly the way institutions erode when the decisions being made in private rooms finally become impossible to contain. What comes next is genuinely uncertain in a way that royal coverage rarely acknowledges openly. A formal abdication conversation appears unlikely in the immediate term, if only because the constitutional complexity would add another layer of crisis to an institution already dealing with more than it can comfortably manage. But unconfirmed reports point to the possibility of emergency internal briefings, of conversations within the Privy Council about the management of royal duties during a period of extended crisis, of contingency planning that the palace will not confirm publicly but cannot avoid doing privately. The formal public statement from William that sources say may come within days would itself be without precedent. A future king stepping publicly into the space the present king has been unable to fill. Royal expert assessment this week was perhaps more pointed than anything we've heard in years. The observation that William and Catherine's conduct, moral standards, and sense of duty are what will ultimately save the monarchy carries within it an implicit verdict on the conduct, moral standards, and sense of duty of the generation that preceded them. It's diplomatic language for something fairly direct. The institution has been damaged by choices made at its highest levels, and the only way forward is through the people who didn't make those choices. King Charles did not create Jeffrey Epstein. He did not manufacture Andrew's associations or his behavior, or the decades of institutional decisions that kept the consequences of that behavior from arriving sooner. But he inherited a family and an institution and a set of loyalties that made confronting those consequences feel, at every stage, like something that could be deferred a little longer. And now, the deferral is over. The consequences are here. And the man who spent his entire adult life waiting to be king is fighting cancer while watching the institution he spent that lifetime preparing to lead face the kind of reckoning that quiet management can no longer absorb. The question I want to leave you with, the one I think will define how this period of royal history is eventually understood, is this: at what point does loyalty to a person become a betrayal of an institution? And who, inside the walls of that palace, has been asking that question long enough to finally force the answer?